Tonight, we begin with a development that U.S. officials, NATO commanders, and Western intelligence analysts had feared, anticipated, and quietly prepared for. A threat that unfolded not over weeks, not over months, but in a matter of hours. Hours that changed the trajectory of this conflict. Hours that forced Washington to make a decision it had been delaying. Hours that may have permanently altered the balance of power in Eastern Europe. What Vladimir Putin did today crossed a line that the Biden administration had hoped would hold. And when that line broke, Washington did not hesitate. They responded with speed, with precision, and with overwhelming force. Not military force, not yet, but the kind of force that changes what is possible on the battlefield. Tonight, we break down exactly what Putin threatened, why the White House called it unacceptable, and what the massive U.S. military package announced just hours ago means for Ukraine, for Russia, and for the future of this war. For weeks now, there had been signals, not official statements, not diplomatic cables, just signals that the Kremlin was preparing something unprecedented. Putin has been aggressive, yes, but he has been calculated in his aggression. His moves have followed a certain rhythm, a pattern, almost a predictability. But what set off alarm bells in Washington this week was that the pattern went silent. Intelligence officials who monitor Russian military communications know the indicators. The movement of strategic assets, the repositioning of command structures, the unusual activity at key military installations, the sudden silence from normally active channels, all of that went quiet. And whenever the Kremlin goes quiet, it means something is about to get loud. For those who have been watching Russia's behavior over the past 3 years, this silence was not peaceful. It was ominous. It was the kind of silence that precedes storms. U.S. surveillance assets, satellites, signals, intelligence, human sources on the ground all began reporting the same thing. Russia was repositioning. Russia was preparing. Russia was about to make a move. The question was not if, the question was when. And the question was how severe. Early this morning, U.S. intelligence agencies detected what they described as an unprecedented escalation in Russian military posture, including the activation of strategic bomber units that had not been mobilized in over 18 months. These are the kinds of assets that Russia only deploys when they are signaling something very specific, imminent large-scale offensive action, a direct warning to NATO, or preparation for strikes on critical Ukrainian infrastructure. Analysts didn't know which category this fell into or whether it fell into all three at once. But what they did know was that Putin was changing his posture. And when a nuclear-armed adversary shifts posture without explanation, even by the smallest measure, the Pentagon pays attention. Within hours of detecting this shift, the White House convened an emergency meeting of the National Security Council. The Secretary of Defense was present. The Director of National Intelligence was present. The Chairman of the Joint Chiefs was present. This was not a routine briefing. This was a crisis response. And what emerged from that meeting would reshape the entire landscape of Western support for Ukraine. The warning issued by the State Department tonight was not normal. It was not routine. It was not symbolic. It was urgent. Officials after officials, briefing after briefing, described Putin's move as reckless, provocative, and perhaps most importantly, indicative of desperation. But threats only work if the target hesitates. Washington did not. In fact, the response today was among the most significant military assistance announcements we've seen since the war began. Here's what we know. Within 6 hours of Putin's threat becoming public, the Biden administration announced a massive military aid package worth over $2.3 billion. These weren't the standard defensive weapons. These were advanced offensive systems, long-range missile capabilities, enhanced air defense networks, and armored vehicles that Ukraine only receives when they are preparing to launch major operations. The speed of the announcement was itself a message. Washington wanted Moscow to know we were ready, we were watching, and we are not backing down. Tonight, Pentagon officials confirmed that the United States is expediting delivery of advanced weapons systems to Ukrainian forces, including ATACMS missiles with extended range capabilities that had previously been withheld due to escalation concerns. Ukraine struck before Putin could execute his threat. They hit ammunition depots deep inside Russian-occupied territory. They hit command and control centers that were coordinating the very operation Putin had threatened. They hit logistics hubs that were likely preparing to support a massive new offensive In other words, Ukraine targeted the infrastructure of the threat itself, the command structure that would have made it operational. This is what made Washington's warning so urgent. Putin's threat wasn't just rhetoric, it was actionable. It represented the kind of escalation that could fundamentally alter the conflict if left unchecked. And Ukraine, understanding that fully, responded with force, not recklessly, not impulsively, but strategically. They didn't target civilian areas. They didn't strike Russian territory proper. They hit military targets. They hit strategic assets. They demonstrated that they have both the capability and the intelligence to neutralize threats before they materialize. And they did it with weapons provided by the United States, proving that American investment in Ukrainian defense is paying dividends. And here's where the story becomes even more significant. U.S. intelligence officials now believe that Putin's latest threat was designed to test the resolve of Western allies. After months of political uncertainty in Washington and European capitals, Putin wanted to see whether the West would blink, whether NATO would fracture, whether Ukraine's supporters would quietly step back. But instead, the opposite happened. Washington didn't retreat. They announced the largest military package in months, a response that was so swift, so comprehensive, that even Moscow noticed. You don't get the Kremlin's attention easily. But today, the Biden administration did. Defense analysts speaking with NBC News under anonymity described Putin's approach as coercive escalation, a way to frighten the West into reducing support for Kyiv. But Washington proved today that they remain both committed and capable. Their response was not only fast, it was calibrated so precisely that the weapons announced directly counter the specific threats Putin made. That calibration matters because it shows something crucial. The United States has real-time intelligence on Russian planning. It shows that Washington is not reacting to events. They are anticipating them. They are staying one step ahead. And for Putin, that is a deeply uncomfortable reality. As reports continued coming in throughout the evening, we learned more about the scale of Ukraine's response and America's commitment. Ukrainian forces carried out over 40 precision strikes on Russian positions, forcing the evacuation of at least 3 forward command posts. U.S. military advisors confirmed delivery of advanced radar systems that had been requested for months but held in reserve. NATO allies operating logistics networks in Poland reportedly doubled their capacity to move weapons into Ukrainian territory. This wasn't just a response. This wasn't just a counter move. This was coordinated escalation management. This was strategic dominance. And strategic dominance is the one thing Putin has struggled to maintain since the early days of the invasion. For every advance Russia has made, Ukraine has countered with something that complicates the Kremlin's calculations. For every threat Putin has issued, the West has responded with actions that render those threats hollow. Tonight was no different. Remember, Putin thought Ukraine would fall in 3 days. He thought NATO would fragment under pressure. He thought the United States would lose interest and move on. He thought Europe would prioritize cheap energy over Ukrainian sovereignty. But tonight, the exact opposite is happening. Ukraine is stronger than it was a year ago. NATO is more unified than it has been in decades. The United States is accelerating, not reducing its military support. And Europe has fundamentally restructured its energy dependence away from Russia. Every assumption Putin made at the start of this war has been proven wrong, and tonight's events are just the latest chapter in that ongoing miscalculation. What makes this moment so critical and so dangerous is that Putin's latest threat happened at a time when he is under enormous internal pressure. Russian military bloggers want more aggressive action. Russian oligarchs want the war to end so sanctions can be lifted. Russian mothers want their sons to come home. Russian generals want resources that the economy can no longer provide. Putin is balancing these demands while fighting a war that has lasted far longer than anyone in Moscow expected. And when leaders in that position make sudden, dramatic threats, they're not doing it from strength. They're doing it from pressure. They're doing it from vulnerability. They're doing it because they feel cornered. And cornered leaders are dangerous leaders, which is precisely why Washington's response today was so carefully calibrated, firm enough to deter, but measured enough to avoid triggering the kind of spiral that no one can control. The White House statement, now circulating through every major news outlet, was designed to signal that the United States is not willing to allow Russian threats to dictate the pace or scope of Western support. Officials said plainly that Putin's actions were inconsistent with responsible international behavior. That is diplomatic language for, we see what you're doing and we're not intimidated. You don't usually hear that tone from the State Department unless something serious is at stake. The language was direct, the message was clear, and the timing within hours of Putin's threat was intentional. Washington wanted the world to see that American resolve is not weakening. If anything, it's intensifying. Meanwhile, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky addressed his nation in a defiant, resolute speech tonight. He said, "We do not respond to threats with fear, we respond with action." He said, "Every missile they threaten, we will answer with precision. Every escalation, we will meet with strength." And he said, "Ukraine stands not alone, but with the full weight of the free world behind us." These are not rhetorical flourishes. These are statements from a nation that understands just how high the stakes have become. Zelensky knows that this war is not just about territory. It's about the future of the international order. It's about whether aggression can be rewarded. It's about whether democracies will stand together or crumble under pressure. And tonight, his message was clear. Ukraine will not crumble. Here's what makes the situation even more concerning. Putin's latest threat wasn't isolated. Along with the mobilization of strategic bomber units, Russian naval forces in the Black Sea also repositioned to offensive postures. Belarusian military units conducted unusual exercises near the Ukrainian border. Russian cyber operations increased attacks targeting Ukrainian energy infrastructure. All of this happened within the same 72-hour window. When Russia moves multiple pieces at once, it means something larger is underway. It means coordination. It means planning. It means intent. And that intent must be met with equal coordination from the West, which is exactly what we saw today. Intelligence analysts are now considering several possibilities. One is that Putin is preparing for a major winter offensive designed to break Ukrainian morale before spring. Another is that Putin is attempting to provoke a response that he can use domestically to justify further mobilization. A third possibility, the one worrying officials the most, is that Putin is attempting to create a crisis significant enough to fracture Western unity before critical elections in Europe and the United States. But today, Washington took that card off the table. They didn't delay, they didn't debate, they didn't send mixed signals. They responded with clarity, with speed, and with overwhelming commitment. And in doing so, they sent a message that transcends this single moment. The West is not going anywhere. What we're watching now is a test of resolve. Putin wants to see if threats can achieve what his military has failed to deliver. Ukraine wants to show that it can absorb pressure and continue advancing. Washington wants to prevent escalation while maintaining support. And NATO wants to demonstrate that collective defense remains the cornerstone of European security. All of these objectives are now colliding in real time. The next few weeks will determine which vision prevails. Tonight, we've heard from Pentagon officials who are now monitoring Russian military movements around the clock. They say there has been no reduction in Russian posture since this morning's threat. They say additional assets are being moved into position in occupied territories. And they say Putin's decision to escalate is likely part of a broader winter strategy intended to test Western commitment during a politically uncertain period. But Ukraine is not retreating. In fact, Ukraine is advancing. Their response today, swift, precise, and devastating, sent a message to Moscow that threats will be met with action. And it sent a message to Washington that every dollar invested in Ukrainian defense is a dollar well spent. As the night goes on, we expect more details to emerge about what exactly Putin hoped to achieve with this threat. But what we do know is that Washington's response was timely. It reassured allies. It deterred further escalation. And it demonstrated that American leadership remains the backbone of the Western alliance. What happens next will depend on what Putin does in the next 48 hours. If he backs down, this moment will be remembered as another failed attempt at coercion. If he escalates further, Ukraine and its allies have already shown they are prepared. They have shown they are unified. They have shown they are ready to respond. And tonight, for the first time in months, the Kremlin appears to be recalculating. Moscow is quiet, too quiet. And when Putin is quiet, it means he is thinking. It means he is choosing his next move carefully. Because tonight, Vladimir Putin learned something he has learned many times before, but perhaps never so clearly. Threats without capability are empty. The West is not divided, and Ukraine is not defeated. This story is far from over. But tonight, one thing is clear. Putin's gamble did not pay off. Washington's resolve did not waver, and Ukraine remains standing stronger, more supported, and more determined than ever. And we will be here watching every detail as the next phase unfolds.